Can you see this slide? Hello?
Yes, Doc. Right.
Yes, you can see the slide.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So we're going to talk about ecological characteristics of weeds. In fact, in this lecture, what we are going to do is to try, sorry, hello? Yeah, ndichafora pane presentation and read. Okay, so we're going to talk about the characteristics of weeds. In fact, weeds are a special group of plants with unique characteristics, which distinguishes them from the ordinary plants. This is a soybean crop with weeds. So, what are weeds? Uh, there are several definitions of the term weed, but a weed can be a form of vegetation that is highly successful in agricultural environments. Or you can just say it is the vegetation which we find in agricultural environments. So weeds grow in environments disturbed by man without being deliberately planted. This was according to Baker in 1965. Now, if you clear a field, you remove the vegetation. A few weeks later, you'll find that there are plants growing on that patch of land. The plants which are growing, we term them pioneers of secondary succession. Now, we want to talk about the weed success in the agro ecosystem. In other words, the agricultural fields should be very risky for ordinary plants to grow there because there's always weeding, plowing, use of chemicals, and such a highly disturbed environment can destroy plants. And you need plants which can withstand that disturbance. So the definition of success of the weeds is a rapid colonization of disturbed sites. You need plants which can rapidly grow in disturbed environments. They should also be difficult to remove. Now, you can have suppression of the productivity of crops as a result of the presence of weeds. Now, we wanted to understand uh, what weeds are, or we just want to find the weeds, plants with certain characteristics uh, which constitute what we call weeds. Now, there are two approaches. The first approach was used by Macarthur, Wilson, and Wilson in 1967, Then this was followed by Pianga in 1970. They used what is called the R and K strategy. Then another scientist known as Grime used what is known as the CSR theory. What we are saying is that our environment has got a lot of plants in it, and not all those plants are weeds. So we should have some criteria of distinguishing these weeds. So we have got these two approaches. The first one by Macarthur and Wilson, 1967, and Pianga, 1970, which is the R and K strategy. And then we have this other CSR theory. So let us start with the MacArthur and Wilson. Now, what these scientists did, they said that you can actually divide the plants into two categories or into two groups according to the strategy of evolutionary specialization. You know, these plants are always evolving in the environment, or it could be any other organism. You can use this theory and you can still apply it to plants. So the first group, which is R group, we have R selected organisms which are adapted for colonization and reproduction in disturbed environments. That is the agricultural fields. So the plants which we find in agricultural fields where there's high disturbance, you can classify them as R selected plants. So the R species occupy the early stages of succession. Agricultural weeds seem to be the R species. So the agricultural weeds or the plants which we see in arable areas belong to the group R. Then, on the other hand, we can have vegetation outside the agricultural fields, where we have forests, a lot of trees, grasslands, which are quite stable. These plants are known as K-selected plants or organisms and are adapted for persistence and reproduction in the stable environments. So where you find forests and grasslands, the vegetation is quite stable. So we say the K-selected plant species occupy the last stages of selection. Probably, let me simplify this a bit. Let's suppose you open a field, you plow it, you've disturbed the environment, and you don't plant anything there. If you visit that disturbed place, you are going to find that there will be plants growing on that patch of land. And that group of plants represent the R selected plants or simply agricultural weeds, right? And if you leave that patch for a number of years, if you go back to it, you may find that there will be trees growing on that patch. And with subsequent years, you may find that that patch will turn into a forest and probably some grasses, and it becomes a stable environment. the early plant species may then tend to disappear. So, in fact, if we want to view weeds, we have to look at the whole array of plants which cover the earth. And then we can make some distinctions. Now, some people said that this was a very simplified approach, and they had to come up with another theory. Anyway, this graph is representing the two groups of plants. Here at the bottom, here we have got R selected population where there's a lot of disturbance. Then with the time, you reach the K selected population, which is stable. These are the number of individuals. So sometimes we can represent this by a graph to distinguish the weeds which are at the bottom and these plants which form the ordinary vegetation where you don't normally find weeds. Now, the second theory, which was proposed by Grime, is known as the C, S, and R selection. Later on, I will explain what these letters mean. Now, there are plant strategies of adaptation that define the role of environment in determining plant succession. So, the environment plays a lot in actually determining the type of plants which are found in any given area, whether it is in agricultural field or outside the agricultural field. Unlike the first approach, which just distinguishes plants into two groups, this one can classify plants in various categories. Now, the factors which limit plant material in an environment, or the factors that affect the vegetation or weeds in an environment, are two. Number one, we have what is known as the stress or factor that limit plant production. Now, that stress or factor could be soil moisture. If it varies, it can affect plant growth and reproduction. The other issue is the nutrients. Soil nutrients can limit or can affect plant production. Also, things like soil pH can also be important. The other one is the disturbance, which can be due to plowing or hand hoeing or cultivation, which leads to the destruction of plant biomass by men. So, two processes. It could be environmental stress interacting with disturbance. Then it can produce a set of plant species in a given area. I'm still going to define what is S, what is the C, what is R. Basically, if the interaction of stress and disturbance produce three environments or three types of habitats which produce distinct different types of plants. I'm going to use this table to show the interaction of number one, intensity of stress. This could be, moisture or soil fertility times intensity of disturbance. So we just have two categories for intensity of stress: low intensity and high intensity. On the other treatment, again, we have got low disturbance and high disturbance. So let us look at the interaction of low stress and the low disturbance. Here we have got plants with a competitive strategy. They will thrive in this environment. That environment could represent conservation agriculture because we are not disturbing it. But at the same time, there is low stress because we are putting a lot of fertilizer. We are also having moisture. Then we have low stress times high disturbance. Again, this is agricultural field which is under conventional tillage, where we are doing a lot of plowing, putting in a lot of fertilizers. Then we have got this high stress, where there could be low moisture, fertility. This is outside the agricultural zone. And we have also low disturbance. So we have got stress tolerant strategy. Probably this is where you find the grasslands and the trees which are outside the agricultural zone. This is where you may find some forests. This year we had the drought, but we still have some trees and grasses, although our crops could have been affected. Then we have got also an interaction of high stress and high disturbance. This is not no viable strategy. Probably this may represent some deserts or a coastline, which are always disturbed by water movement, or in deserts where there's extreme stress. Right. Now the letters C represent a competitive strategy. The letter R represents a rural strategy, and the letter S represents stress tolerant strategy. So this C, S, and R, this is where they come from. They come from the interaction table, which forms uh, these areas: competitive strategy, stress tolerant strategy, rural strategy, and no viable strategy. Probably these are deserts where you don't find anything growing. So this is the Grimes CSR theory. which tries to explain about plants and where we find the weeds fitting in the vegetation. Now, the C plants or competitors, they maximize the capture of resources in productive and undisturbed environments, which may be no conservation agriculture environments. They are abundant during early and intermediate stages of succession. Then we have stress tolerant. These could be trees and grasses growing outside the agricultural fields. These are long lived plants adapted for conditions of limited productivity and occupy what we call the last stage of succession, because these plants are always changing. Ruderals probably represent the weeds, which are short-lived herbs with high seed production, and these may occupy the earliest stages of succession. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. I can hear you.
Do you have any issues so far?
And all good, straightforward.
Okay. Now, the Grimes CSR theory, let's suppose you were collecting data in the field and you wanted to analyze it. Normally, we use a triangle. It's a special triangle which is used to analyze the situation. Let me just explain this triangle. It has got this side here where we have a relative intensity of disturbance. This could be the plowing effect. Then relative intensity of stress. This could be moisture stress, soil fertility, nutrient stress. And this is relative intensity of competition by plants. So what you need to remember are the two are the three side the three corners of this triangle. The top corner here, which is written C and represented by this box. The plants in this area have competitive strategy. This is where you find the trees and the other grasses outside the agricultural zone. No, this is where you find some weeds which may grow in conservation agriculture. Sorry about that. The left corner where you have S, this is where you find trees and grasses which are stress tolerant, right? And these are quite stable. This is outside the agricultural field. Then you go to that corner here. This is where we have agricultural fields. Uh, R represent the weeds. This is the corner of the weeds. Also here we have some weeds, but probably occupying reduced tillage systems. Now, if you move to the center of this, uh, we have another inner triangle. And let us look at the sides, the three sides. Here we have got a mixture of plants, some weeds and some trees and grasses. On the left, we have got these are all weeds. Down here, you've got some trees, grasses, and also some weeds. Because normally, even if you go in a forest, sometimes you will find the weeds, especially where there are some small disturbances. Then at the center, you will find everything. So if you are doing a weed survey in certain areas, and you can actually classify these plants, you may find that you may have in agricultural field, maybe you have a lot of plants occupying this corner. Reduce the tillage, maybe some plants in here. And outside farming, you may have trees and grasses. So we use this triangle. There could be some papers, which analyze plants in agricultural fields or outside the agricultural fields, and it can use this approach. So if you read around, you may find something on it. So this was just an attempt to try and find where we can fit weeds within the vegetation. Because if we can understand that uh, issue, it may be easier for us to control these weeds. So basically, from what we were saying, according to Grime, weeds could be competitors and the ruderers or competitive ruderers. Okay, let me go to the triangle again. We said weeds can be competitors occupying this box. They can be ruderers occupying this box, or they can be competitive ruderers occupying this area. In this area, maybe it's outside agricultural fields. So, what are the characteristics of these plants? They have a rapid early growth. They grow very fast. Then they capture resources early. They have high seed production. These are some of the traits which we want in a crop. So let us talk about this trait competitiveness, because weeds are endowed with competitiveness. They are capable of taking nutrients better than the crop and also harvesting sunlight better than the crop. So weeds are adapted to the agricultural environment. They have strategies that maximize rapid and prolific growth. They can have reproduction in disturbed habitats. Some weeds have large quantities of reserves stored in perinating organs that result in rapid foliage expansion. For example, cynodon dactylon, tsangads. Some weeds have got a large, vigorously growing shoot and root systems. These are traits for competitiveness. Extensive height so that they can harvest light. Now, timing of emergence of seedling or sprouting. maybe in such a way that the weed will have an advantage over the crop. For example, the weeds may emerge before the crop has emerged, and they start utilizing resources. Then density. Now, density can determine whether weeds are going to be harmful to the plant, or even timing of emergence. If it is late emergence, sometimes the weeds are not that competitive. So competitiveness is one of the characteristics of weeds, which makes them harmful to crops. So we said that not all plants are weeds. For example, according to Holm et al. 1977, only 250 plant plant species out of 250,000 plants represented weeds. So it's just a fraction. Actually, there are just 76 world west weeds. In order to get an idea about the weed, Baker in 1965 proposed a concept of an ideal weed, which has got 12 traits or 12 characteristics. So let us look at these characteristics of an ideal weed. Now, for an ideal weed, number one, germination requirements should be fulfilled in many environments. It doesn't matter which environment, the weeds are able to establish themselves. Probably we want such a crop which can be easily established. The other trait is that, unlike crop seed, if you take a crop seed and plant it, uh, we almost get 100% germination, and the emergence is good. But with weeds, just a few seeds may germinate, and we call this, or we term this, discontinuous germination, which is internally controlled. And we may have seeds which may stay in the soil for a long time. And sometimes we use this term longevity. We say the weed seed has great longevity, meaning that it can stay within the soil for a long time. The other one, this discontinuous germination can also be seen when we see weeds emerging, at different times throughout the season. Number three, rapid growth rate through vegetative phase to flowering. Now, for maize plants, probably they may have something like between 70 and 80 days to reach flowering. But with weeds, it can be shorter. There's also continuous seed production for as long as growing conditions permit. So, continuous seed production. Probably we may want such a crop. Now, with weeds, there's self fertilization. In other words, if you start with one plant, it can self fertilize, it can undergo self fertilization and produce more plants. We say self-compatible, but not completely autogamous or apomictic, because sometimes cross fertilization can take place. Now, selfing can produce pure lines. If we were talking about breeding with weeds, you can they exist mostly as pure lines, but we also have some hybrids because number six, we also have cross pollination taking place. And for this to occur, we have unspecialized visitors uh, or wind pollinated. So we could have hybrids from weed species, just like what we are doing with our crops. We were breeding crops suitable for the agricultural environment. Weeds are also doing the same thing naturally to produce plants which can get adapted to agricultural fields. Very high seed output in favorable environmental circumstances. If we're talking of crops, we may talk of high grain yields, but these are weeds. We talk of high seed output. Then weeds number 8, they produce some seed in a wide range of environmental conditions. So they are tolerant in the plastic. Now, I know with some crop varieties, uh, they are bred in such a way that they are well targeted depending on agroecology of a country. For example, in Zimbabwe, we've got 5 agroecological zones. So we have got some crops which are bred so that they are suitable for growing in Chiredzi. Some are suitable to grow around Harare because they are 2 different agroecological zones. But with weeds, they can just do well across the agroecological zones. With the climate change, where sometimes you get droughts, sometimes you get heavy rains. Probably you want a variety which is tolerant or plastic to these environmental conditions, just like what weeds do. Because in any season, you are going to harvest something, whether there's drought or too much of the rainfall. Number 9, weeds are adapted to short and long distance dispersal. This is how weeds can colonize different agricultural areas. Now, if we have a perennial weed, normally it has a vigorous vegetative reproduction or regeneration from fragments. If you try to physically control this weed, you are breaking its stems, and these stems will regenerate into plants. So it's one of the traits of vegetative weeds. If it is also perennial, there are some weeds which can easily break. We call this brittleness. So if you want to pull it, it just breaks, and it has some vegetative parts remaining underground, which will give rise to new plants. This is also a survival mechanism. Now, weeds are able to compete interspecifically, meaning that they can compete with the crops by special growth means. For example, weeds can form a rosette pattern, which means they can grow in all directions, thus choking the crops or choking growth. They can also produce chemicals. So these are the 12 characteristics which can describe a weed, and this can distinguish it from ordinary plants. So this is the end of the first part. Hello.
Yes, Doc. Hello.
Yeah. Any questions on the on some of these issues concerning weeds?
For me, it's just the root arose. Yo, it's a big word.
Any issues?
Nah. It's just the big words. The root arose.
Anyway, what we are now saying is that you know, with the crop varieties, you can actually describe the a variety, and sometimes they write something about the variety, whether it's a short season, long season, and state some of the traits. Now with weeds, we also have these traits, and there are about 12 characteristics, uh, which makes a plant a weed. Now, what we are going to do, because I have just listed those 12 characteristics, the other issue which we wanted to do is to explore probably some of those characteristics in detail so that we have a real understanding of these weeds. So, do you want us to proceed to the next lecture or we do it tomorrow?
I don't know others, but I think tomorrow is okay.
Yeah, so I think let us stop here.
Okay, Doc. Thank you so much.
Yes. Then tomorrow we will continue with we will explore these characteristics.
Okay.
It will give you time to go and go through
Thank
it.
you, Doc.
Okay, so we meet tomorrow same time.
Okay, Doc. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay.